Yeah, please come up and take some of the seats. There's seats. If you have an empty seat next to you, raise your hand, please. So, yeah, lots of room.
Folks, if you're looking for a seat, the people with their hands up have an empty seat next to them.
Don't be afraid.
Yeah, we can't have people just standing on the edges, so if possible. Yes, Mike, come early.
All right, should we get started? Okay. Yeah. Good evening. Welcome to the History Department's Fall 2017 teach-in on historical perspectives on current events. My name is Brian Ogilvie. I'm the chair of the History Department here at UMass Amherst, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Today's discussion focuses on monuments, memory, and white supremacy. Historians respond to your questions. As with our event last fall on the 2016 election, our discussion will address questions that members of the UMass and the Western Massachusetts community posted online for our historian panelists to consider and to address. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists, but I'd first like to say a few general words of introduction in response to a very general question that we received, which one of my colleagues will return to at the end of the formal Q&A. Namely, why and how do monuments matter? And why now? Why indeed did avowed white supremacist Richard Spencer lead an armed, torch-wielding mob in August through the campus of the University of Virginia to a statue of Robert E. Lee? Why did some activists and city council members call on the city to remove the statue? And why did others, not only Spencer and his supporters, and not only self-described white supremacists, oppose the call, claiming that proponents of removing the statue were trying to erase history? Why do monuments to the long-distant past summon up such rage in the present? Before attempting to answer that question, I think it's worth taking a step back and reflecting on the past, history, and commemoration. To paraphrase my historian friend Rebecca Stang of Indiana University, the past is everything that has happened and is gone. History, in turn, consists of the stories that we historians tell about the past on the basis of the documents and other material remains that have survived to the present. Monuments, in their turn, usually celebrate some aspect of the past that the community has chosen as a fundamental part of its common heritage, or at least the community's self-designated leaders have so chosen. Though in the later 20th century, some monuments were erected as warnings against the follies and crimes of the past, as well as celebration of its greatness. In itself, then, the act of removing a monument is not erasing history. When the statue of Lee is removed from its place of honor in Charlottesville, his name will not somehow magically disappear from the literally tens of thousands of history books on the Civil War in the University of Virginia Library and elsewhere. Another point we should keep in mind is that memorials are not products of the moment in the past that they commemorate. They're products of a later time. This medal, commemorating Martin Luther's 95 Theses Against Indulgences, was minted in 1617 to mark the 100th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. It is a product of the 17th century, not of the 16th, though it refers to the latter. And if we look at when monuments and memorials to the U.S. Civil War were created in the United States, as this graph shows, we see that they date mostly from two eras. The period from the 1890s through the 1930s, over there. The period when Jim Crow laws were implemented and racial segregation was strengthened in the North as well as in the South. And, somewhat later, this period here, in the Civil Rights era, from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. So, although they are, in a way, historical products, they're not products of the Civil War itself, but of practices of commemoration surrounding that war. Why did American cities, and not only in former Confederate states, build monuments to Southern Civil War soldiers and politicians exactly during the periods when segregation laws were being established and then challenged? And why were monuments erected to Lee, to Stonewall Jackson, to Jefferson Davis, and many others, but not to people like James Longstreet, Lee's longtime right-hand man? Might it have something to do with Longstreet's support for post-war Reconstruction, including leading African American militia troops against white supremacist paramilitaries? I'll let my colleagues respond to that question, but I wanted to begin by raising it. To sum up, in a way, monuments are a part of history, but they are not the history of the past that they commemorate. They are the history of the time when they are created and erected, and they are the history of the time when they are challenged. To return to the question, why now, we need to focus on what is happening in American society in 2017 that has led many people to call, not only to call into question the values that led to Confederate memorials being erected in the Jim Crow and Civil Rights eras, but to demand their removal or their historical contextualization, as others have requested. We also have to ask what is happening that has led others to insist on keeping them, sometimes an insistence that results in violence. Those are vital questions for us to confront, and historical context is vital to getting the answers right. So those are some of the big overarching themes that our panelists will address. I would now like to introduce those panelists, and I'll just go from your right to your left. So I'll begin with David Glassberg, who is professor of history and interim co-director of the public history program here at UMass, who has written, among other things, on historical pageants, Civil War monuments, and other commemorations of the American past. Alon Confino, professor of history and Jewish studies, and the inaugural Penn Tishkoff Chair of Holocaust Studies, and director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies here at UMass. Professor Confino has written, among other things, on the culture of memory in Germany and on remembering the Holocaust. John Bernd Olsen, who is Associate Professor of History and Interim Co-Director of the Public History Program here at UMass. His research has examined historical commemoration and memory practices in the Communist German Democratic Republic, the former East Germany. John Higginson is Professor of History at UMass Amherst and is a specialist in the history of Southern Africa and comparative racial violence. Among other things, he's worked on truth and reconciliation in South Africa. And finally, on the left is Alice Nash, who's Associate Professor of History here at UMass, who researches and teaches the history of Native Americans in the Northeast and other indigenous peoples as well. I would like to pass on regrets from Professor Chris Tinson of Hampshire College, who regrettably is unable to be here tonight. I apologize to those of you who came here specifically to see him. And before moving on to your questions, I'd like to just give a shout out to Jessica Johnson, the Director of Outreach and Public Engagement. Who, although is not appearing here on the panel, has been indispensable in organizing and publicizing this event, as well as to Arlene Bousson, who is our communications assistant, who helped get the word out and encouraged all of you to be here. So what we're going to do today is begin by asking panelists to respond briefly to the questions that we received in advance, some of which we've edited for concision or combined with related questions. So if you hear your question in a short version or in a version that seems to be an amalgamation, that's why. And then they'll respond briefly. If another panelist would like to chime in, they may do so. Following that, we'll have a discussion with the audience going until about 7:30 when we need to wrap up and let everyone go home. So I'd like to begin with my colleague Alice Nash. And we had a couple of questions that related to her expertise in indigenous peoples' history, especially in the Northeast. One of them relating to the presence of two statues on our own campus, the Minuteman and the figure of Manawampe. A question about what they represent, particularly the confrontation of those in terms of the space that we occupy. How do we understand them to be interacting with each other, with us, and the space that we occupy that was formerly inhabited by Native American peoples? And more generally, what can we understand about public controversies around monuments, memorials, place names, and mascots in other parts of the country? How do those developments relate to what's going on here in Western Massachusetts? So, Professor Nash.
I'm gonna. Okay, I'm going to come up here so I don't have to keep twisting around, but hello especially to my students. Thank you for coming. Let's hear you. My guys. Make me look good in front of my colleagues. So the question of indigenous peoples and colonization and monuments and mascots is an enormous question, and I'm only supposed to start by talking for about 3 minutes. So I'm going to make some key points, but please, if you want me to elaborate on something, ask as the panel goes on, because we want to, what makes this interesting is the intersection of our different conversations with each other. I have a bunch of different slides, depending on different topics, so I'm going to whiz through them. If you see something you want me to come back to, we can do that. I think I'm going to start really with this one. So, in one of the original formulations of the question about land, a person used the word stolen. You know, is the land that UMass is on, the land that Amherst is on, is this stolen land? And that is a very common formulation, a common way that people use it. And I think that's a good starting point, because if your approach to indigenous people's history and to colonization that is ongoing is to look at the past and say, oh, those people were bad. They cheated the Indians. The land was stolen. People died out. They were conquered. In a way, that's a very privileged position for non-indigenous people like myself, right? Because if we just think the land was stolen, we have no responsibility to understand that, in fact, most of the land changed hands through mechanisms that were legal according to colonial systems, that these people from England and France and Spain developed elaborate systems and protocols and rigged games, if you will, that sort of make most of these land transactions legal in some way or another. So rather than just sort of absolving yourself and saying, it must have been bad to take the land, right? What are the mechanisms that still exist today that allow the land to change hands in this way? And I may only get past into this one slide. When I was a kid, well, anyway, the one on the end with the Mass Turnpike, that's the Mass Pike sign that I always saw as a child when driving up from New Jersey to visit my relatives in Massachusetts. Now you can see that they've now taken away the arrow, right? But the use of this iconography is a way of conditioning people to accept a certain version of reality. We sort of acknowledge that we are on Indian land, but we celebrate indigenous peoples in the past. Right? We like to sort of take on the cachet of what's heroic, but we don't really want to acknowledge it. This is currently the seal of the University of Massachusetts. I've been complaining about this for years. It used to be that if I was talking to you, the seal would be on the front, so I would basically be standing behind a racist symbol and not seeing it for myself. This symbol of the UMass seal is based on actually the original seal of Massachusetts Bay, where the original model was come over and help us. And the only remnant of what used to be a Minuteman for about a minute during the Revolutionary period is the sword arm over the Indian's head. So maybe you can see that this image is problematic. And one of the crazy results, this is a student from the class a few years ago, is that when we use the seal, again, they've gotten rid of that format in the library, and it's maybe not fair for me to show the picture, right? But basically, you wipe your feet on an Indian, you wipe your mouth on an Indian, you walk past the statue of Mattawampi, who we celebrate as the legendary spirit and not as a real person. So there's a lot of real history to be found. There's a lot of important issues today. But I think the most important issue that I want to just throw out is that all of these monuments and mascots erase the real ongoing processes of colonization that are still taking place today, so that these things that we might think are bad happen legally. And that's a different challenge than just, complaining about Columbus.
Well, thank you, Professor Nash. I'd now like to offer the floor to Professor David Glassberg. We have a couple of questions that he's going to speak to. One of them we might see as a provocative conceptual question. Why do many Northerners think all the monuments to white supremacy are in the South? Coming from a UMass graduate student. And then we have a very specific question. There are two memorials honoring Confederate soldiers in Massachusetts public spaces. A granite monument erected in 1963 at the Civil War fort, and another a plaque that reads in part in honor of Confederate soldiers, affixed in 1925 to an 1891 statue honoring Union soldiers on Martha's Vineyard. So the question is, what are the criteria that officials should use when they're charged with the decision whether to keep a monument, keep it but add interpretive signage, or remove it? And based on what you know of the Massachusetts monuments, which of those options would you suggest for both of those monuments right now? Yeah, there is. And Twitter is also in advance.
I guess I do. I'm going to thank you. I'm really delighted to see so many people here. It's really great. I'm going to get to the second question, but I want to contextualize it by talking a little bit about Civil War commemoration. And some of this is literally illustrating what Brian was showing with that graph. The earliest monuments after the Civil War in the North were really angry. And that's to be expected because, in fact, a lot of people died in the Civil War. A lot of people were murdered on both sides. And if you look at this monument in Deerfield, and this is just a plinth, or the obelisk rather, you can see Libby Prison, and then right around it is Andersonville and the other Confederate prisons where Union soldiers were held and died. What's interesting is that within a relatively short period of time, like this dates from the late 1860s, I forgot the exact date, the more typical monument on the New England town common was something like this. This is in South Hadley, and this is the standing soldier. And the soldier is really not very angry. He's placid, he's solid. An art historian, Kirk Savage, has done a really great job talking about these standing soldiers as embodying a whole white male. And if you think about all the people who came out of the war with all kinds of injuries, this is in some ways a comforting image to people as well. Just as an aside, a lot of these standing soldier statues were manufactured in Chicopee, Massachusetts by Ames Company. They used to make swords during the Civil War. And they were so good at making these monuments that they sold them in one version in the North and another version in the South. So I would say the next phase in this, and this is really where I want to get into how the North figures in this, is if I were to put it in a nutshell, it goes from kind of anger to appeasement or reconciliation. And this idea that at all costs, there needs to be this reunification of North and South. And if you remember Ken Burns' film, The Civil War, it ends with the Gettysburg 50th anniversary commemoration and Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers shaking hands over the hedge where Pickett's charge had been. Historian David Blight described that scene and said, I think very aptly, that white supremacy was the master of ceremonies at these reunions. So that leads to, of course, the aggrandizement, if you will, of Robert E. Lee in the 1890s. As people have pointed out, he wasn't such a central, beloved figure until then, and it became kind of this myth of the lost cause, and a lot of the mythology of him as the genteel, soldier. And this is the statue of Richmond, which they still haven't quite figured out what to do with because it's so big and so large. The North did have a counterpart, and I just want to point it out and call your attention to it. And this is the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial across from the State House. And this, of course, commemorates the white leader Robert Gould Shaw and the Massachusetts 54th Colored Troops. And for its time, and I would even argue for our time, it's a really beautiful monument. It's one of the few images of African Americans which is very accurate, and he had life models as opposed to caricatures. But it represented, I think, kind of a departure from the normal kind of reconciliation kind of statue. And of course, all the monuments were depicting whites, and this is unusual because you actually see African Americans not just present, but actually carrying weapons and taking action to create their freedom. Which brings us to this. Okay, so this is the exact title of this thing. This is on George's Island, and this is the memorial to 13 Confederate prisoners of war who were stationed there at Fort Warren and died. It was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Massachusetts chapter, in 1963. Those of you who already know this story, please don't butt in. I'm just going to ask. So, if this showed up in your harbor or in your backyard, what would you do with it? Especially, say, in June of 2017 with all the tensions about Confederate memorials. What should we do with this? Well, here's what the state did with it. Oops, oh, that's the close-up, so you can read the text, I'm sorry. Which even mentions the war between the states, which is kind of the southern version of the Civil War. So, again, what would you do with it? Well, you board it up. And that's how the state dealt with it. If you would argue with issues of racism in Massachusetts, this is a highly symbolic act, in a sense, covering over the story rather than, doing anything to really challenge the narrative that the story tells. And actually, the next phase of this just happened last week. After Columbus Day, it was removed entirely, and it now sits in the Massachusetts State Archives. And Secretary of State Bill Galvin, who's the archivist, took it, and he's offered to mail it back to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. If they wish to retrieve it, we could make arrangements with them. We agreed to take it because we don't want to see it destroyed. We're not trying to destroy it, but we want to make sure that once it was removed, it was kept in a safe place. And of course, it's in the archives, and it's out of sight, and it's not on public display. So, again, I'm interested in, what would you have done with this? We've had some fun discussions about, well, what if instead of removing the thing entirely, you just were to remove half of the boards? If you did that, then you would kind of get to see a little bit of the monument, but you would also see the act of boarding it up. And it would be a much more active kind of engagement with it. Anyway, you can come up with your own solutions to this. And actually, it sounds like if you contact Secretary of State Galvin, he'd send it to you if you want to do that. Unfortunately, I couldn't answer the question about the Martha's Vineyard one, but hopefully, if someone else in the room knows something about it, we can get to it later.
Okay, thank you, Professor Glassberg. It will take just a moment here while I get AD for our next presenter up and running. We're humanists, not techies. while I'm giving that running, the next set of questions are for Professor Higginson. We have two questions about the removal of monuments.
You want me to read them?
Yeah, if you could do that, that'd be great.
Okay, two questions about the removal of monuments. While the removal of most Confederate monuments from public spaces may seem easy enough, there are others that cannot easily be picked up and moved to another setting, like the massive Confederate memorial carved into the side of Stone Mountain, Georgia. Do you imagine any alternative ways to acknowledge the white supremacist histories of such difficult-to-remove memorials? We could add Mount Rushmore to that, but... given the long history of statue and monument destruction or removal as a result of political or ideological shifts, can historians offer guidance on how to address problematic or contentious memory practices? So those are the questions.
Professor Higginson.
Good evening. How is everyone? Good. Before I start in on these questions, I want to make a statement, like most academics do when they're placed in such positions. People rarely commit to or risk their lives for abstractions, such as white supremacy, colonialism, socialism, or nationalism. Rather, such ideas become normative standards for continuously assessing one's real needs and capacities. Can I ensure my family's welfare now and in the future, for example? Am I self-sufficient? Am I powerful in my own right or in relation to others who are less capable and secure? The footpaths leading to sustaining activism and extreme causes are usually strewn with mundane preoccupations and short-term calculations about life chances. And I think whenever we assess why people manage to erect monuments to causes that are now reprehensible, we need to ask ourselves that. When people demand that those monuments not be taken down in the present, we need to ask, well, why do they think that way? And it has a lot to do with how they see the world, the country, and their particular place in both of them. Now, I have had some experience with dealing with monuments to nefarious causes in South Africa. I was a member of the ex post facto academic group that reviewed the findings of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And one of the things that we trained our attention on was a series of murals in New Clare, which is an old white working class neighborhood in Johannesburg, which is not that now. But in New Clare and in Turffontein, there are murals commemorating the 1922 Rand Rebellion, which was important because it was the only or the largest instance in the 20th century where a state put down a workers' rebellion, strike and rebellion with airplanes, with the Havilland warplanes and tanks. the 20,000 white mine workers in South Africa of that day had organized because they believed that with the plummeting price of gold, they believed that they would soon be replaced by black workers, by African workers. And so the slogan of their general strike was, "Workers of the world, unite and fight for a white South Africa." It also occasioned, once it morphed into a racial pogrom and rebellion against the government of the day, it also involved the murder of hundreds of black mine workers and also women and children. And again, the question we have to ask is, however horrible we may think these events are, how did it stand? How did the circumstances in which this violence took place, how did it resonate with the way those people lived? That's not to say that we should have empathy for people who do horrible things, but we can't make them cartoon characters either. We have to understand them as human beings rather than as moral monsters, which some of them may have been. So with regard to monuments to a violent and racist past in our own country, I don't think there is any singular way to deal with them. But I think that we do have to remember why they were placed there in the first place. And in order to do that, I want to cite very quickly a statement made by General Jubal Early in the Shreveport Southwestern on the occasion of a monument, a proposed monument in Shreveport to the freed slaves and to the idea of freedom in general. And this is what General Early said on 20 February 1867, a day after my birthday. He said, and I quote, by the way, the monument was never constructed, but these are his words in 1867, a year before, or the year in which the 14th Amendment was passed, and which southern states had to model state constitutions on the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union. And this is what General Early said. He says, "As for all the enemies who have overrun or aided in the overrunning of my country, there is a wide and impassable gulf between us, in which I see the blood of slaughtered friends, comrades, and countrymen, where all the waters in the firmament, above the seas and below, cannot wash away. They may employ the infamous Hope." Hope was the provost marshal of this particular area of Louisiana, and had scheduled a number of Confederate officers above the rank of captain for long prison terms and summary execution. Most of those judgments were overturned. He said, "They may employ the infamous Hope with his Bureau of Military Justice to sacrifice other victims on the altar of their hatred. And provost marshals and agents of the Freedmen's Bureau may riot in all the license of petty tyranny. But our enemies can no more control the verdict of impartial history." Notice how he invokes impartial history here. Our enemies can no more control the verdict of impartial history than they can escape that doom which awaits them at the final judgment. So there you have General Early on the occasion of a proposed monument to freedom and the emancipated people, the free people of the state of Louisiana in 1867. I think that if you were to follow the construction or the sort of run-up, the construction of the monument at Stone Mountain, or any number of other monuments to the Confederacy, you would have these kinds, you would have to, first of all, apprehend these kinds of conversations that took place before those monuments were erected. They were erected for a purpose, for a reminder to Southerners at that day that the Confederacy had lost the war but won the peace. And if it wanted to continue to win the peace, it needed such monuments in everyday life. So that's all I have to say, and we'll move on.
Thank you, Professor Higginson. Our next speaker is going to shift our focus a little bit. Our last two speakers are historians of Europe and who address global issues, and so the next questions are for Professor John Olsen. Just a moment here while I be back to the previous slideshow. So for Professor Olsen, we have a couple of questions, one of which comes from a UMass history graduate student. The first question is, how have other countries that have memorialized difficult histories or dealt with memorials that celebrate racism? What can Americans learn from lessons elsewhere? And a related question, one common theme I've heard repeated in this debate is that monuments help people learn about the past. Can monuments, in fact, help people think critically about history? Is there a monument you can think of that incorporates complex historical discussion into its design without requiring substantial independent research by the visitor? I might gloss that as saying, are there monuments that teach as well as celebrate? So, Professor Olsen.
Thank you. Well, let me tell you one story, and then I have one example that I want to show you for the two questions. And so after World War II, obviously Nazi Germany was full of racial propaganda, racism was embodied in the regime. But nationalism, when we think more broadly, predates the Nazi period and was around for much longer. And so after World War II, the remnants of those who were now in power had to deal with not only the Nazi past, but also the nationalist past of the Second Empire. And so if we take the city of Berlin, I think they did a very progressive approach to this, and they formed a committee that was politically balanced. It was made up of politicians, city planners, and historians, art historians. And they did a survey of all the monuments that were standing after the war, and came up with three categories. One was not ideological, should stand, right? So they stand for their artistic values. A second category of artistic value, but clearly propaganda. We didn't know what to do with this one. And then there were those that were clearly propaganda and would have no other purpose other than to support the regime. Right? And so that third category, those were destroyed. The second category, they were removed but put in storage. They won't see the light of day until 2016. But they're off to the side. Researchers could see them if you needed to. And then the first ones were left alone. After the fall of communism in 1989, 1990, the city of Berlin felt they had the same issue. They now had a city that was saturated with communist icons and statues. And what did they do? They turned back to 1946, 47, and they repeated that process. They did another inventory, and again used the same three categories of those that were not political. So a lot of memorials that were in cemeteries and places like that where there was obvious connection to the place they were built were left alone. There were others like Vladimir Lenin, his statue, which many have seen in a movie, Goodbye Lenin, fly through the city of Berlin on a helicopter, which never happened. In fact, it was broken up into about 300 pieces, except for the head was kept whole. And it was buried in the south of Berlin in some sand. And then there's Ernst Haelman, who actually still stands, covered in graffiti, with his fist held high, clearly a piece of propaganda, had no connection really to the city of Berlin from Hamburg. They wanted to destroy it, but they couldn't. It cost too much. So but they followed a process, and I think we'll learn, that other examples of processes. And the only other thing I wanted to say is monuments that you can contextualize. So that's something we hear a lot. Let's leave these monuments, but then add some context. Well, how many people read those signs? Right? So, do people actually engage with reading itself? But let me give you a counterexample of where maybe it did work. Buchenwald, which is one of the famous concentration camps just south of Berlin, outside the city of Weimar. It has a very mixed past, right? It was a concentration camp, then it was a Soviet internment camp, and then it was a place of communist propaganda. Now it's back to being a museum. What do you do with these gigantic memorials, right? So this is 1.5 lifetime size. It's not, it has gigantic, well, it's even more than that. You can see a person for perspective. Behind it, this gigantic tower. This is just a tiny part of a very large memorial complex, right? And those 3 rings are grave sites, so they don't want to disturb them. They don't want to tear things down. Right? So instead, the German government decided to build a museum that tells you the history of the memorials. Right? And this is placed just as the entrance to the memorial. First, you go through a welcome center that tells you about the troubled past of this site, the mixed history of the camp itself, but also the history of how did this monument complex come about, and the various things that happened here. There was even, many different funny commemorations, including an what do we call it, orienteer marathon. But then they had to stop because there were bombs that were going off that they would trundle across the woods. But troubled history, contextualization, maybe you don't have to go as big as a monument or a museum, but there are ways to do that. So, thank you.
And our final speaker before we turn to a wider discussion is Professor Alon Confino. He is going to be addressing a couple of the general questions with which I opened and promised we would return to, as well as a specific question from an alumnus who couldn't be here, but that I think is an important one to address. So he'll begin with the question of how do monuments and memorials matter? What do they mean and when do they mean it? And why? Why have they emerged now in the United States and elsewhere as a particularly pointed subject of public debate? And there's also a question that we, I think, need to raise in this connection. It's from an alumnus who's living in Tucson, so he won't be here to hear it, but we thought that you would like to hear it. What is the place of anti-Semitism in contemporary U.S. white supremacist movements? The chanters in Charlottesville mentioned that we will not be replaced by Jews, among other things. What is the connection between this movement to protect certain kinds of monuments and contemporary anti-Semitism? So, Professor Confino.
Thank you, and thanks for all of you. So, why do we remember the past? Why do we remember it all individually and collectively, our past? We remember because it tells us something about where we came from, where we are going. How did we arrive here? It tells us something about ourselves, collectively and individually. We all remember the past. It's one reason why all of you should be history majors. Apart from this. And that is why when we remember the past, we remember it in our own way. That is, with our repressions, denials, embellishments, and lies. We lie ourselves about our past. Why? Because we remember the past in order to tell ourselves something about who we are in the present. We remember our past not in order to get the past right, but in order oftentimes to get it wrong, to tell us something about ourselves in the present. And that is why remembering the past, whether it is individually or collectively as a nation, is so important. Memory matters. How we remember the past matters. It tells us who we are. Who is us? There is no us. The American people is a figure of speech. There are different remembrances in this society. And that is why what we remember is important. In each society, there are fundamental pasts, foundational pasts. In German history, it's the Holocaust. I'll get back to this. In Jewish history, it's also the Holocaust. In American history, it's the Civil War and slavery. This is a foundational past. Since 1865 or 1861, or maybe even before. No, before not, because the war happened then. Since then, Americans remember the Civil War and slavery. They remember it whether they do it in words, in monuments, or whether they are silent about it. You cannot think of yourself as American without having something to think, to say, or to feel about the Civil War and slavery. Even if you tell yourself, I don't have anything to say. This in itself is a statement. What I want to say, that societies remember the past. Americans remember the Civil War and slavery since 1865. Our job is to understand how they remember, to understand the history, that memory as a history. And that's why it is important for us to understand why now, suddenly, we have yet again a conflagration over Civil War and slavery remembrance. I say yet again, because of course it's not the first time. And it's not going to be the last time. So we have to contextualize the memory wars that we have. So when we think about how we remember the foundational past, why is it that now we suddenly have this remembrance again? Everything by association about Germans and how they remember the Holocaust. So in the 1980s and 90s, there were a lot of controversies in Germany about how to remember the Holocaust, whether the Holocaust was unique. What is the place of the Third Reich in German history? Is it just a footnote? Is it just a deed of a madman who was an Austrian Hitler? Or is it really part and parcel of German society the Germans have to acknowledge? Not be responsible. One cannot be responsible for what happened before we leave. But when Germans said, we love our soccer team that won the World Cup, it's part of us, we love Goethe, it's a bit different, but it's more or less the same. Because he's a great one. Do they also say, we also acknowledge the bad part of our history as much as we acknowledge the good part? This is what we mean when we say we internalize a certain past as being part of us. Not that we're responsible, but that we understand that it makes us also who we are. These debates in the 1980s and 90s were seen by some scholars then and some people as harmful, as divisive. But when we look at them now, we understand that they were a necessary step to understand, a necessary step in the journey for self-consciousness, in the journey to understand who you are as a society, as a nation, what belongs to you, what doesn't belong to you. So, in association, I think that the present debate in American society, which is so divisive, is not necessarily harmful. It's not harmful to who we are as a society, to what we believe in, to how we want to look at each other. And hopefully, the good side will win, because in this debate there is a good side and a bad side. Not always there are two sides that are equal. You know, if I'm going to bring to who speaks about Holocaust denial. Not everything has two sides. Some things have one correct side. So, but it is important for us to debate it. The question is, what is the framework of the debate? And here I want to go again to Germany. The framework of the debate in Germany, or the framework of how Germans feel or think about the Holocaust, is not that all Germans think that it was terrible and it was only the fault of the Germans, etc. Some Germans have not internalized the Holocaust. There are descendants. But the message that is being directed from the political leadership in Germany, since Willy Brandt, who was the Chancellor of Germany in 1970 and thereabout, is clearly that Germany is responsible. That there is a certain historical responsibility that cannot be denied. And this directive that came from above led ultimately to create the Holocaust monument, Bolshoi, from the German Reichstag, from the German parliament. If we think about America, there is a way to debate these things. One way that I think about it is following President Obama's singing of Amazing Grace after the Charleston massacre. This is one way in which you frame the debate. Another way in which you frame the debate is under the current president and his reaction to Charlottesville. So, what our political leadership, the way it frames the debate, is very important to how we conduct this debate. And the message that is being sent from the political leadership, I think, is very important in shaping the debate, in making the debate what it is. And in this sense, I think citizens, students, professors want to know about what kind of a debate are we speaking about. First of all, they have to study the history of the memory of the Civil War. We are not the first to talk about it, and we are not going to be the last. Certainly, we have, I think, to see that the current debate comes from a certain opening up of the political rhetoric to views that existed always in American society, but had very little legitimacy. They are here, they are part of us. They are part of all of us as Americans. It's not something that is alien. But the question is how we conduct this debate. And it's up to each one of us to think what he or she wants to contribute.
Great. Thank you, Professor. I would like to give the panelists just a brief moment to respond to their colleagues' remarks, if they so wish. And then in the remaining half hour or so, we'll open up the floor to questions and discussion.
And also, if people want to find seats or move out.
And you want to say?
I'd like to hear from the audience.
Yeah.
All right, we would like to hear from the audience. So we have someone with a microphone in the back, and we would like to solicit not just questions for our panelists to respond to answer, but also your responses to their remarks, so that we can have a conversation. All right, we have some mic problems, so I'll stand here and please, who has a question?
I'm actually really loud, so
It's
I'm
okay.
going to be really louder than the microphone.
Yeah, but some people
Well,
have
behind
hearing
you, it's hard.
problems.
You flip the job.
Yeah. Just stand.
No.
Just stand up.
So I'm wondering, I guess I have a two-part question. The first part of that is, I would ask that any of the panelists possibly approach a definition of what white supremacy actually is. And the other side of that question, in terms of who is framing the debate, I find it very interesting that that is a predominantly male panel, and that there is only one definitely identifiable person of color on stage. Not that I'm saying that I can judge anyone's ethnicity by looking at them. And I wonder if anyone would care to address that.
All right. First of all, what is white supremacy? I think that we can certainly identify white supremacy with a long history of inordinate privilege that has shaped not only individual lives, household lives, but the life of the country. And not only the life of this country, but many of the countries of the West. And by the West, I mean the sort of North Atlantic treaty countries.
Can we use a microphone? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. And we are now faced with a sharp challenge to continue white supremacy of an external nature. Since between 1987 and the recession/depression of 2006, I would say 7-9, we have seen significant portions of the structure of the global economy shift from the North Atlantic world to the North Pacific Asian world. And that with the stock market crash about 1987, we saw the structure of the global economy shift to the North Pacific Asian world. 200,000 jobs in the New York stock market were lost automatically. Paris, London, Berlin, Frankfurt experienced the same thing. And from the time of that stock market crash to the recession/depression of 2006-8, we have seen large elements of the real economy shift away from the North Atlantic countries to the North Pacific Asian countries. If you doubt that, look at the labels in your clothing. Open up your computer. Look at your cell phone. Raw materials from Central and Southern Africa, coltan, wolframite, and lithium go into cobalt and copper go into make up, cell phones and computers that we use every day. But the problem, that shift was combined with a generation and a half long stagnation of wages, and not just the wages of non-white people, but white people too, right? And that has compelled, or the response that many people in this country and in the West in general, since interest rates are not rising, investments are stagnating. If you have $10 million to today, you will only get about $200,000 or $300,000 in a return on that investment. As a result of all of those things, the West has suddenly become very paranoid about the sort of changing of the guard, the shifting of the center of human civilization. And that, I believe, is the larger context in which we are operating with everything that we've seen since the election of President Trump.
Just like to speak to one thing. As one of the people who helped to organize the panel, I just want to add that we did invite Lisa Brooks, a female Abenaki, and also Chris Tinson, African American, to join the panel, and they were unavailable.
Well, I guess I like to make a distinction, and people might disagree with me on this, between conversations about white privilege versus conversations about white supremacy. So for me, I would distinguish that with saying, in a society that is organized from its inception around the idea that people from Europe have certain rights that other people don't, where there's certain kind of institutional privileges built in, there are many ways in which, although I know some people feel that it's not true, structurally there are a lot of benefits that go with being perceived as white, that people may not intend. You don't have to be a racist to benefit from living in a racist society, that sort of construction. What's really catching my attention increasingly is, I think, fittingly called white supremacy. It's sort of this bursting of a boil where people are really being challenged, where they thought, how do I say this? It's the idea that white people are better, and they should be better, and that anything else is threatening. And it causes people not just to be aggressive, but it leads to this kind of cognitive dissonance where you displace you just sort of erase or pretend that certain kinds of things aren't true because they don't sort of conform. They don't conform to what you would expect. And so I had a really brilliant example like 2 minutes ago when John was talking of what I meant by that. But I think, for example, it's the idea that I'll speak more about Native Americans. And actually, I will say I'm Asian American, so whatever that perception is. I grew up with people sort of saying, oh, you speak really good English, and I get both sides of that, right, depending on my weight. But the idea that indigenous people are somehow takers, when in fact this nation was built on exploiting bajillions of dollars of lands, of resources. We continue to do that, and yet somehow we perceive Native Americans as the ones who are taking or looking for a handout. That's really quite a kind of intellectual gymnastics that it could just be ignorance, but I think there's also a way in which that's fueled by the assumption that our society is based on a certain kind of people being on top, and anything that challenges that, we displace that. The late Arthur Manuel from the Suquamish Nation in British Columbia wrote a book called Unsettling Canada. And he talks about his work of really addressing colonialism through economic means. And his approach is to go to Moody's credit ratings, right, Standard & Poor's, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and to point out that the credit ratings of nations, like the United States and Canada, right, we have supposedly a top credit rating, well maybe less so now than we used to, but your credit rating is based on an assessment of your assets and your liabilities. Right? If you were going to buy stock, you would expect the prospectus to include information on the assets and liabilities of the company that you're buying. And if you don't give a fair disclosure, there can be legal consequences. And he said, the United States and Canada ignore the fact that there are lands that are being contested under treaty rights, that they have treaty obligations, that if Canada were to actually pay what it owes to indigenous peoples, our credit rating would be downgraded. And so, of course, in the United States, people say, how is that possible? We're America, we're Canada, we're great. How can you apply those standards to us? Right? Those standards don't apply to us. But in fact, when he traveled around the world and spoke to, more international organizations, they're like, oh yes, the same standard applied to everybody. The United States is not declaring its liabilities. They should not have that credit rating. But there's a mentality, that's the kind of situation that I think is only possible when you have an ideology that most people just take for granted. That sort of says, oh yes, the United States, European nations superior, Indians are takers, African Americans want handouts. The rest of us, we're not stealing anything from anybody, and we can build an oil pipeline, and you can take away all of the protections that would make me liable for the environmental impacts of a disaster or the effects or impact of radiation on communities having children with handicaps. We don't want regulations that make us avoid those consequences, and we also don't want to pay for those consequences. And that doesn't look like welfare because
we're the corporations, right? So there's a kind of, to me, that's the distinction between privilege, whereas the ideology is more aggressively being asserted.
That's not hypothetical. I mean, look at the relationship of Exxon and British Petroleum to people living in Louisiana, in southwestern Louisiana.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. Are there more questions? Who is the next one?
I don't feel America addresses slavery or racism or the Civil War. We pretend that it didn't happen or it's in the past. We feel because we had a black president that racism is gone. And he was attacked his whole presidency, especially by the current president. It's hard to know that people of color have to watch themselves now. If you're African American, if you're Native American, if you're Latino American, especially if you're Muslim, you're in trouble because if you're around the groups that dislike you, they're going to attack you. Our life is in danger now. People feel they can punch you in the face, shoot you dead, blow up your church because of the color of your skin. And it upsets me that we recess back to me instead of going forward. And I'm curious how all of you felt about our current president.
How do we feel about our current president?
I'll just say one thing very briefly. And among all the other intellectual challenges that we have right now, is that if we thought we had this narrative of progress, we're learning something different. And, in a way, that's why I think that, particularly for Massachusetts, a boarded up memorial is symbolic in so many ways, because it's stuff that we're covering up.
I see your point, but I'm not entirely in agreement. I would say that there are ups and downs. There are fluctuations. We are not going down the drain the whole way. If we look in the last 50 years, there have been also great advancement in this society about the treatment of minorities, of African Americans, of others. The election of Obama is one of them. The African American Museum on the Mall is another. I think that what is important is the economic situation of minorities, African Americans and others. And I think in that respect, one does not need to be a white supremacist in order to discriminate against others. And sometimes the discussion about white supremacists even takes us away from what needs to be done. White supremacy, I think, is a group of people who believe that whites are better than people of color.
Group of people. It's a series of institutions. It's not a group of people.
And that's
per
what
se.
I was just that have institutions and that want to change the legal structure of this society. One can be racist without wanting to change the legal structure. He or she may not want to work with people of color in his or her field. But white supremacy, when we speak about it, it is really a political movement that wants to change things. So in that sense, racism still exists. Even after white supremacy will hopefully go back to the marginal place it belongs. And
Could I?
yeah.
So first I want to acknowledge that what you're talking about is people being killed. So there's a literal violence that people are experiencing or they're hearing about secondhand, or there's obviously a range, whether it's happened to you personally or you've heard about it or you're afraid about it, but you're talking about very specific violence. And then there are other kinds of structural violence, right, that exists.
let's see if I can, are my slides sooner or later? Okay, so there are different levels of violence, and so, for example, in many communities, but because my field is more indigenous peoples, there's an epidemic of suicide happening among young people. There's an epidemic of women who are missing and murdered, and many of those missing women is happening in a context that's associated with these big construction projects, these pipelines, where you have these man camps, where these workers are coming and they're away from their family and there's no military structure to protect them, and the jurisdiction protects non-indigenous men who commit crimes in native territory. So there's a lot of literal violence. And then my dad was a civil rights guy, and he used to say each person has their own best area of effectiveness. So I do want to acknowledge we need the theorists of white supremacy, we need people teaching, we need people on the streets, we need people keeping their children. There's a lot of these levels, and they're all important. But for indigenous peoples, part of the violence happens because literally, as long as you have these mascots, and you have groups of, it's not the native people fighting for the mascots, let's just put it that way. What is it about your self-esteem that's so fragile that you have to hold on to those freaking symbols, which have as their logical extension some yahoo with a head on a stick running around saying kill the Indians, and how do you take a child to a sports game, right? Why is it a surprise that native people, they don't even need somebody killing them because they're killing themselves, opioid crises and things like that. So to bring it back to this particular focus on monuments and memorials and museums and how we think about those things, they're not really just neutral. If they were neutral, why would people be running around putting up more Confederate monuments on private land and saying, ha, 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 we can do this? It takes money to do that. Somebody has to have the land, somebody has to raise the money, somebody has to sign the statute, somebody has to get the materials, somebody has to do the physical labor. You don't find poor communities raising, for the most part, these kinds of monuments. So they're big, they're complicated, they're more than we can get through like in one short thing. But I'm just so glad that everybody came, and I'd like to hear more questions from other people.
I just want to say one more. So this last fall, the history department did a similar event, and it was talking about the election. And one of the things the message we were trying to get across is history doesn't repeat itself. He's not Hitler, right? But driving in today on NPR, I heard something that really kind of fits your question, and it was, everything he's doing is legal, right? He's very careful that all these steps that disturb a lot of us, and he's rolling back a lot of progress that we've made in the last 30 years with the swipe of a pen or through his administration, throughout the departments. But he's very careful that everything is legal or can be defended legally. And that scares me almost more than that. In that sense, we also have to remember Hitler was elected, right? He came to power via legal means, right? Mussolini did not, right? Mussolini seized power and was forced to hand it to the king.
So did Franco.
And Franco. But more worrisome are any state can become authoritarian, right? And so I think one of the messages we had last fall was defend the institutions, right? So that you have the three branches of government, that you see that there's clear separation, because once they merge, that's when you have real problems.
Right.
Yeah.
The other context that we also have to remember is that the entire West, not just the United States, but France, Emmanuel Macron is an example of that, is that those people who have power and wealth have decided that democracy is too messy, too uncertain. Democratic procedure, therefore, has to be streamlined. So the laws may exist and may have been inherently unequal in their dispensation when they were passed. But people also have to execute the laws, right? It has, for example, if we take the example of Eric Garner in New York, he was not breaking any laws. Matt Taibbi is now writing a book called I Can't Breathe. He was not breaking any laws, but the policeman felt that in order to protect the burgeoning of a new kind of private property in that part of Staten Island, that is multi-million-dollar condominiums, that people like Eric Garner did not have the right to be in a public space. So I think we have to think about also who executes the laws. Presently, Southern Poverty Law Group did a study, a demographic study, and they made 2 demographic maps. They were very striking. One was of the places where fascist organizations have a toehold. The second one was of police departments where it is known that a significant portion of the members of the police are members of one fascist organization or another. In some cases, the percentage is 18, self-reported, 18 to 34% of a given big city police force. Now, that's not enough that's not the majority of the police, but it's enough to shape the culture of the police. And that is something that we definitely have to stand up against. Because, as James Baldwin said a long time ago, in the midst of the repression of the late 60s and 70s, if they come for me in the morning, they will come for you that evening.
Although I'm primarily here as a moderator, I'd like to just offer one final comment. It's instructive that of the 5 presidents elected in the United States with a minority of the popular vote, but a majority of the electoral vote, the 2 most recent ones have been the 2 most recent Republican presidents. Whether one is concerned about that or not, I think depends on your political outpoint. But it is worth underscoring that the Electoral College is a mechanism that was intended by its creators, if you read the Federalist Papers, to stand between popular democracy and the government.
Could I just mention, before you, I'm noticing that we're getting a lot of people, a lot of wonderful people from the public who are coming, but there's a lot of students here, and I really would love to hear some questions from the students as well, because this is your world we're building, so we really need you to be involved.
Well, they're building it too.
Yeah. There we go.
Yes.
Yep.
Kind of gets at what you were talking about. So you have these pictures behind you that are more blatant examples, and the question that I posed was asking about 2 statues on this campus.
Yeah.
And as a Native person on this campus, part of these, what I see on here, or between these 2 statues, is that they interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are like blatant examples, someone dressing like Chief Wahoo, but at the same time, when I walk through this campus, I see the Minuteman actually looking like he's hunting Chief Wahoo.
Right. No, I don't think it's an accident. I don't believe it's an accident.
No, it's not.
They've moved all around campus, and this is where they wound up. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand that it's the current placement of these is happenstance,
But not
but
really.
at the same time, it's it's telling of a larger narrative of who does and doesn't belong, at least in my opinion.
Well,
I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I would just say that I'm just going to go for it. More than my concern about the statue is my concern about the lack of support for Indigenous students and for Native American and Indigenous studies. And the reason why it's so hard to find anybody responsible for it right now is because those of us faculty who've been keeping the program going pretty much for free or whatever got tired of having the university get credit for a program that they don't put any resources into. So we need students to be active and advocate. The statue is part of it. Why doesn't the university know that Native parents who come with Native students take one look at that statue and they think, is my kid going to be safe on this campus? Right? And meanwhile, everybody else is tap dancing and saying, oh yeah, we want Native students, isn't it? So I think you're absolutely right to call that out. And there's, these are really important issues.
There's another question.
So more about the monuments and memories of important characters throughout history, many, in fact, all of the important figures in history were almost never part of their faction wholeheartedly. So my question for you is, how will you remember the ones who were in a gray area for, say, for civil rights?
Can you give us an example?
I'm a second here, I can't.
Actually, I could answer that in a different way.
We should go to the podium.
I'm not sure this quite answers your question, but it addresses something that's somewhat relevant, I think, is that there's been a lot of focus on the presence of monuments like Confederate monuments and other things. But actually, absence is even worse. The fact that we don't see monuments to, well, I have a personal favorite, W.B. Du Bois. You go out to Great Barrington, and we, meaning now the university and a community group, has done a lot to try to raise the visibility, but it is nothing compared to, say, what the National Park Service has done to commemorate Booker T. Washington or George Washington Carver or some other people who frankly weren't necessarily as aggressive in pushing for civil rights. And there's nowhere in the public landscape that you can learn much about Malcolm X. And I could go down the list. And I really would love to see much more emphasis on bringing out people in the Black freedom struggle and memorializing them so that, not only are you going to move this Confederate monuments maybe off to the side a little bit so they're not in such a prominent place, but that you have a much more full representation of history represented on the memorial landscape.
Monuments cost money. And so oftentimes what happens is it's only those people who can raise enough funds and then have the political clout to gain access to public lands have the ability to build these monuments, right? So what can people do? They can pass legislation at local levels that create new guidelines for who has access to those public lands. Maybe there's mechanisms for state support for groups that don't have the wealth behind them to build these kinds of monuments. And Professor Ogilvie passed around a link today to what was it, in the New Yorker, or do you remember where it was? Oh no, okay, maybe I'm misread. Someone, maybe it was Jessica who sent it to us. Okay, Jessica did. Do you remember the source of that? Was that the New Yorker or?
I don't know.
Okay, well,
Facebook. Democracy Now.
Yeah. So the gist of the article, though, was that in the last 4 weeks, there has been a huge upsurge in private monuments to the Confederation that have been...
That was Toussaint Louverture, and it was from Newsweek.
Newsweek, okay, thank you. And that's another kind of concern. So traditionally, these monuments have been placed in public spaces where there is the ability to then take it down if things change. But if someone has a privately owned monument on privately held land, well, we'll have to live with it, right? And so there's a whole other layer of memory politics that we're going to have to deal with in the near future. Okay.
There's an apparently innocuous statue in East Harlem, just as you come out of Central Park, to J. Marion Sims. Everybody know who J. Marion Sims was? J. Marion Sims was a medical doctor who, in order to figure out a way to cure fistula in pregnant women, operated on slave women. Went down to South Carolina and operated on slave women, killing some of them, and in many ways subjecting the rest of them to something that was not unlike torture. So why is there a monument to him in East Harlem? And people pass that monument all the time and say, oh yeah, this is the great doctor who managed to prevent a terrible problem that many pregnant women have. But how did he do it? No one talks about that.
There are ways to represent indigenous people in our public monuments other than the last of their race, weepy Indian kind of statue. One of my favorite ones is fairly recent. It's in Ireland, and it's a monument that people of this place in Ireland built because people from the Choctaw Nation, in the middle of the potato famine, when Irish people were dying, they raised $170, which would be tens of thousands of dollars today, and they sent it over to Ireland to help people. And so here you have this other country that found a way to create a monument to something that is sort of uplifting and worthwhile. Yeah. I would also say that with the seal of Massachusetts, if you trace the history of that seal, there was a brief period around 1692, not coincidentally, I think, related to the witch trials in Salem, when Massachusetts lost their charter and England was kind of flexing their muscles. And England sent back a redesigned seal of Massachusetts that still had a native person on it, only in this case, it had an Indian chief and a colonial governor kneeling before the king, and the two of them are kneeling at the same height. And Massachusetts got rid of that one, like, as soon as we could. But, there are ways we could actually have a native person on the seal, but have it have meaning, right? Or have a different representation. It's not bad of itself, but these Metawampi, we could do something else. I mean, Metawampi was a real person. We could actually talk about those deeds and the history of lands, and why I say it's not stolen, because you will find, if all those land exchanges were theft, if those leaders made one stupid decision after the other and they never learned after 500 years, there'd have to be something wrong with you. But in fact, you have a history of leaders making the best decisions they could at the time, given what they could know. And if we approach those agreements in that way, we would come up with very different histories. So it's not, my students know I'm not a big person for saying something is always bad. There's ways in which it's useful, ways in which it's not. You have to contextualize it. But I just happen to like that.
Okay, would any of our panelists like to have a final word on that question? I believe we are about out of time.
And I didn't mean to subvert that gentleman, so
we may have time for one final question, if anyone is burning to ask.
Yeah.
Don't hate me for this, because it's a hard one to answer. It seemed tonight, when we were going through the history of monuments and they're being taken down, there were, obviously, removal is a big topic. Professor, you were getting at the possibility, I think, in the case of the Boston Memorial, of possibly interpretive signage that would tell the story instead of covering it up and taking it away, that would explain the lost cause and reconciliation and the things that the state found objectionable. And Professor Olsen, your slide that showed the museum in former East Germany, now Germany, I thought, this is as an example, I think, of using monuments that are distasteful to some people and that carry a bad message, in a sense, and educating people about why. And it just seems that is something. It was on the table in Richmond on Monument Avenue. Arthur Ashe is the only real hero on Monument Avenue. There are a lot of Confederate generals and politicians. And the mayor of Richmond, who's African American, was considering interpretation as a possibility. Since Charlottesville, I think that's off the table. But I'm just wondering, how some of you might feel about that as sort of a middle road, to use monuments as a way of education and not just a racism. Because otherwise you're going to be left with the racist symbols, and nothing else.
Well, in order to do that, you got to change the minds of people who have actual power, right? The monuments were put up by people who were powerful, right? So unless you figure out some way to trump that power and put up an alternative view of the country, then it's going to remain problematic. The reason that most Americans, for example, have a view of the Civil War that corresponds to Gone with the Wind, it's not an accident. You know, that's not an accident. You know, you look at the textbooks that they read, the Muzzy and Harris textbook that up until recent times was a standard U.S. history book. So you have to change the relations of power before you can change or you can alter monuments in a way, I think, that betrays or evokes real history or what really happened, let's say.
David.
No, I'm a pretty strong advocate of leaving them up because if you remove them, you really are removing the memory of a lot of things that we should be calling attention to. And, you know, by various means you could recontextualize the monument. One way, like by boarding it up, like you could see, or leaving it half boarded so people know that it's not an accident. They could drape a Confederate monument in black and just cover it. And that has a powerful presence just the way it is that way. What I wouldn't, I'm rambling a little bit. What I'd like to see actually on the landscape is a little more commemoration of intolerance in the sense that if you ask a lot of white Southerners, personally they'll say, oh yeah, I marched with Dr. King, and they didn't. They were part of massive resistance movements or whatever. But that history's been obliterated. Like, we don't know that history, and it's not commemorated, and I'm not saying it should be celebrated in a positive way, and in fact, that's why I wouldn't put a monument up when you think about it, because it'd be a rallying point for a lot of crazies. But I do think that removing evidence of all this stuff leads to a kind of forgetting that could be really dangerous. I also think that words aren't always the best way to counteract or recontextualize the monument. Sometimes it's building another monument next to it that maybe is bigger or makes another statement about it. A very specific example is in near the San Francisco Public Library. There's a pioneer monument that James Lick did that shows, a settler like putting his heel on a Native American. And San Francisco is very upset about this, so they cover it with all kinds of signs explaining, well, in the 1890s, people were racist, et cetera, et cetera. I think they should just put up a giant monument of a Native person with his heel on a white guy, just right across from it, just to call attention to it and comment on it.
Very quickly, I would just say difficult histories are good histories. So contextualizing the talk, having good discussions about them, forcing, as David was kind of alluding to, forcing those conversations is better than removing them from the public sphere. There are exceptions. There are times that, some monuments, as you were saying in your question, are intimidating, that they reinforce fear, and those should be evaluated for those messages, and maybe they should be. So maybe there are different answers for different monuments. But we shouldn't get rid of all difficult histories.
And I'll add a final comment to close. I'm not a modern American historian, which is why I've been moderating rather than contributing. But I do work on early modern Europe. In the wake of the Peasants' War, in which tens of thousands of German peasants rose up against their lords in 1524 and 1525, interpreting Martin Luther's message of the salvation through faith alone and
sold them out.
All believers as a call for social revolution. It was an uprising that was put down very bloodily. Luther himself turned against
sold them out,
called robbing and murdering hordes of peasants. I don't think he was ever on their side to begin with. But leaving that aside, the German artist in Nuremberg, Albrecht Dürer, designed a monument to the Peasants' War. It had sheaves of grain, it had other agricultural products, and at the top was a peasant slumped over with a sword stuck through his back. Scholars have been asking themselves for centuries about reaching a resolution as to whether Dürer meant that as a sign of solidarity for the peasants and their suffering, or for the lords who had put an end to their attempt to rise out of their place. So there are some monuments that are never going to be obvious what they mean. It's not just a modern phenomenon, the monument that calls into question
the very thing that it is a monument to. But I hope at least that tonight's discussion has given you food for thought and a more complex understanding of how monuments have not just a history that they commemorate, but histories in which they are not just a symbol, but an active part. I'd like to thank our panelists for coming tonight. From the U.S. History Department for helping with the logistics here. And most of all, thank you all for coming out on Monday night.
Thank you.
I hope to see you again at the next one.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, I need to run, but I just want to say hi. How are you? You did a great job.
I'll see you. You're coming?